Dick Van Dyke is pretty famous for his charming smile and zestful dance moves, and for nearly a century, he's been the face of warmth and decency in the heart of Hollywood. But few realize that behind that wholesome image stood a quiet witness, one who saw the industry's brightest stars unravel behind closed doors. When the cameras cut and the curtains dropped, their charm gave way to hard booze, obsessive womanizing, and cruelty. These aren't simply stories. They're the buried truths Van Dyke carried in silence for decades. These are the 7 actors he hates most. Chapter 7. Richard Burton. Dick Van was sitting in a sun-drenched reading room, nestled in the quiet elegance of his Malibu home. The waves beyond the window whispered like old friends, brushing against the shore in rhythmic laps that seemed to echo the tempo of a lifetime spent in Hollywood's glare. At nearly 100, his body had softened with age, but his memory was piercing, crisp and painful where it needed to be. That radiant smile, so familiar to millions, faded slightly as he stared at an old black-and-white photograph resting on the side table. In it, Richard held a wine glass like a scepter, eyes brooding, face carved with the kind of intensity that made women swoon and men shrink. But to Dick, that image wasn't majestic. It was haunting. Burton was a wrecking force dressed in elegance, a man blessed with thunderous talent, but consumed by the very vices he romanticized. To the world, he was a Shakespearean titan. To Dick, he was a reminder that brilliance, without integrity, rots fast. Dick had known alcoholism firsthand. He battled it privately, quietly, with humility. But Burton made his drunkenness a spectacle, something sacred, almost divine, as if it were a hallmark of genius. He mocked the suffering that came with it, treating addiction not as a struggle, but as an indulgent rite of artistic passage. The cruelty was what stung most. Dick recalled seeing Burton, slurring insults with surgical precision, reduce a young waiter to tears over a misplaced cube of ice. He remembered the glazed arrogance, the way Burton flaunted infidelities in front of Elizabeth Taylor, who herself seemed trapped in a diamond-studded cage of emotional wreckage. It wasn't just lust or love, it was domination disguised as romance. And when Burton joked about his ex-wives during whiskey-fueled rants, Dick didn't hear humor. He heard a man who found pleasure in others' pain. Burton's legacy, to many, remains immortal and famous. But to Dick Van, it's a cautionary tale. A man who drowned his gifts in liquor, scorched loyalty with lust, and used brilliance as a shield for indecency. Chapter 6. Frank Sinatra. If Richard was a wrecking force of wine and passion, then Frank was something colder, like something more calculated. Power, wielded like a weapon. Under the glittering chandeliers of the Sands Hotel ballroom, surrounded by the perfume of cigars and bourbon, glamour masked something far more sinister. The golden age of Hollywood had many faces, but Sinatra's was its crown and its warning. Whenever Dick Van stepped into that space and felt Sinatra's presence, the air shifted. It grew heavy, thick, and dense. You didn't relax around Frank. You braced yourself. To the world, he was the voice of velvet, the chairman. But behind the crooning, behind the tailored suits and moonlit ballads, Dick saw something else entirely. A tyrant dressed in charm. Sinatra didn't shout when angry. He pierced. Dick recalled a sound technician once made the mistake of letting a brief static hum through the microphone during rehearsal. The room froze. Sinatra walked over, slow and theatrical, stared the kid down and calmly said, "You've got 10 seconds to vanish before I end your career." He didn't yell. Well, he didn't need to. The cruelty was in the precision, how casually he could reduce a man to dust. At private events, it got uglier. If a young actor drew too much attention from a woman Sinatra admired, he would strike with public humiliation, masked as wit. Dyke once watched as Sinatra mocked a rising star's talent in front of a crowd just to put him back in his place. The boy apologized, clearly shaken. Sinatra smiled and said, "There's no room for apprentices here. Go back to where you belong." Dyke, a man built on grace and warmth, despised that behavior. But in that era, power like Sinatra's wasn't challenged. It extended from casino back rooms to the highest studio offices. Speaking out could mean exile. So Dyke swallowed his rage, watched the room go quiet, and carried the guilt of silence. Sinatra didn't need love. He demanded loyalty through fear. And that, to Dyke, was the true corruption of fame, when brilliance becomes entitlement and empathy disappears entirely. Chapter 5. Bing Crosby. People who smile in your face and betray you behind your back leave a different kind of scar. It's not loud or dramatic, but quiet, lingering. And that was the wound Bing Crosby left on Dyke. To the public, Crosby was comfort itself, the voice of fireplaces, snowfall, and family living rooms. The man who could hum a melody and make the whole country feel safe. But sharing stages and studios with him stripped that illusion bare. Dyke didn't remember Bing for warmth. He remembered him as chill, a presence that could freeze a room the second the cameras stopped rolling. Dyke often recalled a variety show taping in the early 60s. Under the lights, Bing beamed like a favorite uncle, clapping Dyke on the shoulder, laughing easily, playing the role America adored. Then the director called cut, and it vanished. The smile, the glow, the humanity. In its place stood a man who looked straight through people, offering no thanks, no nod, no acknowledgement to the crew who had just helped him shine. Standing near him felt like standing beside a draft from an open cellar. What disturbed Dyke most was Bing's treatment of those who couldn't protect themselves. Once, a nervous sound man dropped a microphone near Bing's chair. Instead of concern, Bing gave a stare so sharp it felt violent, followed by remarks laced with classist contempt. Dyke, who made a point of learning names and shaking hands, felt something fracture that day. Then there was the home life image, the devoted father, the gentle patriarch. Whispers had already begun circulating through Hollywood, stories of merciless discipline and emotional coldness. What haunted Dyke was hearing Bing casually recount punishments toward his children with the same tone another man might use to discuss a golf score without shame or tenderness, but only authority. The affairs were no secret either. Carefully hidden, carefully managed. Bing wore fidelity like a costume while quietly discarding young actresses once they became inconvenient. To Dyke, it wasn't just betrayal of vows. It was a betrayal of millions who trusted the image. Years later, Dyke would look at an old photograph of them smiling side by side and feel only irony. Talent can lift a man to unimaginable heights, but it cannot warm a hollow heart. Bing taught him that some voices sing of heaven while living entirely somewhere else. Chapter 4. Peter O'Toole. Some men destroy themselves loudly. Others do it with poetry and a wine glass. Peter O'Toole did both, and left broken sets and worn-out hearts in his wake. Dick Van Dyke never forgot the first time he saw him up close. Those hypnotic blue eyes, the elegance, the staggering beauty of a man who looked like he'd stepped from mythology. But the myth unraveled quickly. O'Toole wasn't a tortured artist. He was a storm that refused to quiet down. Dick understood addiction and had fought his own battle with alcohol. But O'Toole didn't fight. He embraced the fall, wrapped it in charm, and called it freedom. He would vanish from sets, show up reeking of whiskey, laugh off missed lines, and reduce 100-person crews to anxious silence. When someone tried to help or correct him, he mocked them. At one award ceremony, visibly drunk, he interrupted another actor mid-speech with slurred jokes. When a stagehand tried to guide him off stage, O'Toole shoved him and yelled, "You're all puppets pretending to be grown-ups." It wasn't just drunkenness, it was defiance. It was art turned into arrogance. Worse, he pulled others into his orbit. Young actors who admired him were dragged into his world of late-night races, wild games, and emotional ruin. Dick once watched him force an exhausted co-star through take after take, because O'Toole had forgotten his line again. But instead of an apology, he grinned and called it artistic looseness. In a rare quiet moment, seated across from him at a private party, Dick asked if he ever regretted the chaos. O'Toole swirled his drink and said, "Regret is for men who need saving. I don't." That was the moment Dick understood O'Toole wasn't just broken. He had chosen to stay that way. And worse, he wanted company in the wreckage. Chapter 3. Bob Hope. Sometimes disappointment doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and quietly empties the room after it leaves. That was the legendary Bob Hope to Dick. To the people, Hope was generosity itself. The tireless entertainer flying to battlefields, the comforting voice in living rooms, the wealthy uncle of American laughter. But working beside him exposed a colder design. Bob Hope didn't collect money to enjoy it. He collected it to control. Dick first noticed it in small moments. Lunches where wallets never appeared. Rehearsals that ended with assistants quietly covering checks. A five-star restaurant emptied of gratitude, not even a tip left behind. The waiters watched him go with practiced stillness. Dick watched too, and felt something tighten. Hope was unimaginably wealthy. Entire valleys of land, properties stacked like playing cards. Yet every interaction revolved around cost. Time cost, favors cost, even loyalty carried an invoice. The illusion cracked completely backstage at a military Christmas special. A young writer, exhausted from months of rewrites, nervously asked for a small raise. Hope didn't raise his voice. He didn't soften it either. He adjusted his cap and said flatly, "You should feel honored to work under my name instead of asking for money." That was his gospel. Fame was payment. Presence was charity. People existed to orbit him. Dick began to see the famous USO tours differently, not as generosity, but branding. Hope loved soldiers, yes, but he loved what they gave him more. Reverence, headlines, moral polish. He invested in image with surgical precision, making sure every appearance returned dividends. Stories followed, writers abandoned, colleagues refused help. Even his own family whispered to feel the same tight fist despite oceans of wealth. Compassion to Hope was something you spoke about, not something you practiced. At parties, cameras on, he was charming. Cameras off, he ordered people like furniture. Dick once witnessed an aging performer ask for a referral. Hope cut him off mid-sentence. "Hollywood doesn't need the sick or the obsolete. Take care of yourself," and walked away. That moment ended whatever reverence remained. Bob Hope sold warmth for a living. He just never seemed willing to spend any of his own. So, what do you think about Bob? Chapter 2. Robert Mitchum. Some people carry danger like a scent. With Robert, it was more like a fog that trailed him into every room. That slow, heavy-lidded gaze made him seem half asleep, but Dick Van Dyke knew better. Behind those eyes wasn't a mystery. It was chaos with no break. Mitchum didn't just flirt with recklessness, he lived in it. While other actors bent to the studio system, cleaned up their public images, and fought for moral standing, Mitchum did the opposite. Arrested in 1948 for marijuana possession, he walked out of jail smirking, as if it were a press stunt. It wasn't rebellion, It was apathy, one that rubbed Dick the wrong way every time they crossed paths. What hurt most was watching raw talent rot. Mitchum had a presence you couldn't fake, but instead of honoring that gift, he showed up to sets drunk, didn't memorize lines, and treated co-stars like background noise. Dick once heard he mocked a younger actor for caring too much, mumbling, "This job's just standing still and not knocking over furniture." That indifference was poison. Worse, it bled into safety. Mitchum once performed dangerous stunts intoxicated, endangering crew members who didn't have the luxury of being legends. Women weren't spared either. His behavior veered from crude to humiliating, often treating actresses like props for his amusement. But it was the disregard for impact that unsettled Dick the most. In interviews, Mitchum brushed off criticism with lines like, "I'm not your role model." No remorse, no reflection, just cold detachment. To Dick, Mitchum represented what happens when talent loses its conscience. A man in a star's body who treated art like a paycheck and people like props. He didn't burn out. He dragged others into his fire and walked away without looking back. Chapter 1. Buddy Hackett. Some people walk into a room and lift it. Others enter and rot the air. Buddy Hackett always felt like the second kind to Dick Van Dyke. The memory that returned most often came from a sweltering afternoon inside Studio 33 at CBS. Hot lights baked the stage, makeup powder hung in the air, tap shoes clicked across wood. It should have felt alive. Instead, it felt contaminated. Buddy stood off to the side, cigarette dangling, face twisted into that familiar rubber grin America adored. On screen, he was harmless chaos. Off it, he radiated something sour. His humor didn't bounce, it stabbed. Dick had built his career on timing, respect, and cleanliness, of language, of space, of spirit. Buddy treated all of it like a joke. He dropped obscenities as if they were punctuation. He spoke about women like props. During one rehearsal, Dick watched young dancers pour themselves into a difficult routine while Buddy leaned against a flat, murmuring comments about their bodies that weren't jokes at all. They were assessments, reductions, quiet little violations that left shoulders tightening and eyes fixed on the floor. The breaking point came when a nervous costume assistant handed him the wrong hat. Buddy erupted, not playful, not performative. He leaned into her space and unloaded a string of insults sharp enough to silence the entire crew. Dick stepped in without thinking. Buddy turned, eyes narrowed, and sneered, "You're too clean, Dick. That's why you'll never really belong in this business." Buddy meant it. He believed comedy required filth. That laughter only worked when someone bled for it. What disturbed Dick even more was the hypocrisy. He once watched Buddy beam at an elderly fan, signing an autograph with exaggerated warmth. Minutes later, behind a closed trailer door, Buddy cursed her for daring to interrupt him. To him, people were interruptions, numbers, background noise. Even in shared scenes, Buddy tried to sabotage rhythm, throwing crude lines just to rattle co-stars. Dick recognized it for what it was: insecurity wearing spikes. A man terrified of being ordinary, hiding behind vulgarity like armor. When tapings ended, Dick stayed back, thanking stagehands, helping gather props. Buddy vanished in a luxury car, leaving smoke in the studio and a trail of discomfort. Dick carried that feeling home, because cruelty wrapped in laughter lasts longer than shouting ever could. We hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for hanging with us. And be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you very soon.